In a 2023 r/teachers post, a Redditor asked, is this generation of kids truly less engaged / intellectually curious compared to previous generations? There were varying opinions in the comments, but one stood out to me. It's not that they're inherently less capable than any of us were, they're just atrophied. Curiosity is like a muscle, and if you don't use it for a long period of time, it becomes difficult to use it in the future. These kids have never had to be curious because they have their tablets and phones to tell them what they want to watch, without them doing anything other than clicking an app. This sentiment was echoed by others in the replies, with other teachers sharing their experiences with younger Gen Zs and Gen Alpha. The general feeling was that, because information has always been served up to them by algorithms, they'd never had to seek it out to the same extent as previous generations. They didn't have to deal with the chronological or following-based feeds that millennials grew up with, where the content shown to them wasn't always the most quote-unquote relevant or best. In other words, content that keeps users on apps the longest. Previous generations had to search out content they were interested in, even check in on their favourite websites on a daily basis. They learned to Google to verify information, which wasn't always an easy process, and rummage through the results. Google would become a vital research tool, including in education and work. It's still an important workplace skill now. Improvements in technology have since made research a much less manual process. LLMs can quickly turn up mountains of research that would take hours for a human to do. ChatGPT now even has a deep research mode. There's even research from Microsoft that suggests that AI is making us less able to think critically, with a higher confidence in Gen AI being associated with less critical thinking, while higher self-confidence is associated with more critical thinking. But what if we kind of just embrace this? Accepted our own inability to think critically, and kind of went off vibes instead. Let our frustration with society lead us to disregard experts and say with blind confidence that we know best, or even accept our inability to change anything and diminish ourselves in the process. There's a growing tide of anti-intellectualism that's making it cooler than ever to be dumb. But how did we get here, and where is it taking us? This is The Internet's Eating Itself, and let's get into it. As the first fully digitally native generation, Gen Zs grew up as social media and smartphones had reached the mainstream. And social media grew up with them, going from simple feeds of posts from friends on platforms like Facebook and early Instagram, to endless streams of content across numerous different apps. There's now ever more content being created, ever faster by ever more creators, with the intensity of production massively increased by AI. Creators are always live, Discord servers buzz with activity, there's DMs, Substack posts, continual push notifications, live tweeting, it's constant. Of course, most Gen Zs don't use all of these, but more than any other generation, Gen Zs deal with a constant assault of information. They consume media 6.6 hours per day, and are the most likely to consume over 15 hours per day. The sheer volume of information they have to navigate is huge. On TikTok, it's easy to watch upwards of 100 videos in an hour, with the average user spending an hour per day on the app. That's a ton of information just from TikTok alone. Now, you might not consider all of this information. What information is contained in a silly skit or shitpost after all? You might just call it brain rot. But Gen Z is, on the whole, interested in social and political issues, with global data from public relations and research firm Edelman showing that 70% of Gen Zs are involved in a social or political cause, and they're more ideologically varied than previously thought, with Gen Z Trump voters playing a decisive role in the 2024 US presidential election, and possibly the first generation to be more conservative than the last. And social media is where the majority of them are getting most of their news, with 50% of them getting it from their daily, and only 11% never getting their news from social media. They're also less likely to start their news journey on a dedicated news website or app. To many, the news decreasingly means established news orgs. Instead, it can refer to accounts that are much more commentary than simple factual reporting, or it can refer to, often independent, journalists that are much more open with their biases. This aligns with the evidence suggesting that younger people are more likely to agree with the phrase, journalists should be able to express their personal opinions alongside reporting the news. This is a marked contrast from the days when most news was received via a paper that at least presented itself as having a neutral stance, as well as a much greater amount of context. There wasn't the same emphasis on commentary and opinion as there is now, and there were much fewer sources of news in the early days of the internet. It wasn't until social media reached near total saturation and the focus shifted to content that its status as a source of news grew, as legacy news orgs had to compete with smaller creators, while their own revenues from print media and even web traffic collapsed. This has been exacerbated by a wider growing distrust in legacy news orgs, the result of their own failings and politicians' rhetoric around fake news. There's even some evidence suggesting a wider falling interest in news, or news fatigue, which is unsurprising given, everything. Further complicating matters is the merging of news and entertainment, commonly referred to as infotainment, which makes the interpretation and understanding of media messages harder. Of course, this is nothing new. The hyper-commercialization of news has been taking place for some time now, thanks in large part to moguls like Rupert Murdoch. There are many popular accounts that just repackage headlines from actual news orgs for followers to discuss in their replies, or creators that just paraphrase news stories with a green screen effect. This shift has played a role in the collapse in revenue for legacy news orgs and their increased focus on journalism that performs best on social media, such as slagging off Millie Bobby Brown. And just as entertainment stories are given the same weight as politics, politics are given the levity of entertainment, with Jubilee being a prime example of this. You've probably already seen clips, or at least thumbnails, with concepts like flat earthers versus scientists, or Charlie Kirk versus 25 woke students, or one liberal teen versus 20 Trump supporters. The amount of substantive discourse in these is questionable, with more of an emphasis on dunks that can be repackaged as shareable clips for short-form video, used to funnel audiences to full-length episodes on YouTube. Was the news always true and accurate before social media and even TV? No, of course not. Newspapers have always contained speculation and outright fiction, especially in their earliest incarnations. But a crucial difference is the sheer volume of information we're now bombarded with. And this is why media literacy has become such a hot topic and buzzword in the past few years or so. Media literacy now defines it as the ability to decode media messages, including the systems in which they exist, assess the influence of those messages on thoughts, feelings, and behavior, and create media thoughtfully and conscientiously. In short, we must be mindful when consuming media, as opposed to unquestioningly accepting messages at face value. We have to ask ourselves, what motivations does a person have for saying something? The most obvious example is ads, and even these aren't as obvious as we might think. In-feed ads are generally pretty obvious, but that's not always the case, with the most effective ones not being immediately recognizable as ads. Paid promotions are even more subtle, with sometimes the only requirement being 3 characters in the description. #ad, and these can be buried among a mountain of others, with enforcement varying by country too. Age is also a factor here. According to the Raising Children Network, at 7 to 11 years, children might not question what advertisements are doing, be able to tell the difference between entertainment and advertising on YouTube, social media and gaming platforms, understand that products aren't as good as advertisements say they are, or that advertisers might not be telling them any of the bad points. The media literacy required to navigate the current social media landscape without falling victim to misinformation and misrepresentation is extremely high. In some ways, Gen Z never really stood a chance. And that's not to say the rest of us have fared much better, if at all. Gen Z has been confronted with a firehose of falsehood of sorts, a term coined in 2016 by the RAND Corporation, a non-profit, non-partisan research organization that provides leaders with the information they need to make evidence-based decisions. The term was created to describe a Russian propaganda technique, the blueprint for its tried and tested disinformation strategy. Effectively, if you flood the information space with lies, people can't tell what's true anymore, and they often have to give up trying to tell what's true too. If you outpace journalism's ability to debunk lies, report on stories before others have a chance, and repeat your lies enough, you can quickly set the narrative and establish the quote-unquote truth. To break this down, there are 4 distinctive features of the contemporary model for Russian propaganda. Firstly, it must be high volume and multi-channel. Russian propaganda is produced in incredibly large volumes and is broadcast or otherwise distributed via a large number of channels. Second, it must be rapid, continuous, and repetitive. Russian propagandists do not need to wait to check facts or verify claims. They just disseminate an interpretation of emergent events that appears to best favour their themes and objectives. This allows them to be remarkably responsive and nimble. Third, it lacks a commitment to objective reality. This is not to say all of it is false, quite the contrary, it often contains a significant fraction of the truth. Sometimes, however, events reported in Russian propaganda are wholly manufactured, like the 2014 social media campaign to create panic about an explosion and chemical plume in St. Mary's Parish, Louisiana, that never happened. Fourth, it lacks a commitment to consistency. If one falsehood or misrepresentation is exposed or is not well received, the propagandists will discard it and move on to a new, though not necessarily more plausible, explanation. I mentioned the firehose of falsehood not to say that Russia is behind what Gen Z is dealing with, because I don't think they are. In fact, I don't think any single force or shadowy figure is behind this. Call me naive, but I don't think it's a conscious plan on any single entity's part. I think the content ecosystem is just so fully developed, so optimized, so lucrative, there's so much fame, opportunity, and power that everyone wants to get in on the action. Everyone can make a channel or page and pump out posts, with platforms making this as easy as possible. Part of TikTok's success has been down to how intuitive its video editor is. Everyone can have an opinion and build their own platform. If you work smart and hard enough, you can even get rich without leaving your house. You can even make a silly little YouTube channel and upload your silly little videos to it. Importantly, much like the firehose of falsehood, you don't even have to believe what you say. But unlike the firehose of falsehood, the ends aren't always political, they're probably monetary. The profit motive and the financial incentives of social media mean that expressing real beliefs can be secondary in importance. You simply say what gets the biggest reaction and engagement while having the skill to toe the lines of the current discourse. I think some influencers who focus on social and political issues don't even know what they believe anymore. They conflate what will play well with their audience and their actual beliefs. This is how we end up with feeds of falsehoods, where people spread whatever story aligns with their beliefs, whether that be fake Elon tweets or litter boxes in schools. People begin to doubt their own ability to discern truth from fiction and enter a state of learned helplessness. And the natural reaction to this? Anti-intellectualism. If the truth is too overwhelming to decipher, give up, or just go off vibes. For some, they just ignore political and social issues entirely, detach themselves from it, and change the topic whenever they come up. What was once shameful has become fine, normalized, even celebrated. There's often a real resistance to engage in any kind of serious discussion, and I'm defining serious very loosely here. It's not that deep has become a reflexive response for many when another participant goes a fraction beyond surface level, an automatic assumption that any kind of analysis is over-analysis. Sometimes that is the case. Sometimes the curtains are just blue, but other times the color of the curtains matters. As Anushka Pai writes for Intersect magazine, our beliefs are often held with a sense of pride. Questioning these beliefs and realizing we are wrong makes us feel shame. The negative emotions associated with being wrong make us value feeling correct over truly being correct. Similarly, the insecurity of not understanding information often prevents us from pursuing it at all. Anti-intellectualism has taken a contentious form among some women, seeming to embrace belittling stereotypes with the phrase, "I'm just a girl." It's been used to justify anything from being bad at maths, to workplace inadequacy, to difficulty with cars, to generally absolving themselves of responsibility. While commonly paired with No Doubt's song Just a Girl, it's unclear whether the meme preceded the song's recent resurgence in popularity, or was preceded by it. Of course, the song actually satirizes the infantilization of women, with the next line being, "That's all you'll let me be." Accordingly, there's a differing feeling around what the current usage of "I'm just a girl" really means, with one commenter saying that, in their opinion, it's rarely used as an excuse. It's a satirical rationalization of candid and innocent desires that's being punished by masculine-led feminism. Many see it as a proportionate response to decades of hearing "boys will be boys." If men aren't going to progress to meet reasonable expectations, why should women? Or they see it as the inevitable reaction to the unreasonable pressures and expectations placed on women. But the "I'm just a girl" mindset hasn't gone down well with some women.
You're not reclaiming a patriarchal society's stereotype of women, you're playing into it.
Similar concerns have been expressed about quote-unquote bimbo feminism, a niche feminism that sees people adopting a hyper-feminine aesthetic without concern of people's judgments and preconceptions about them, and a confidence in their own values and beliefs. Proponents feel that it's an effective way of using men's desires against them, a kind of pink belt judo. Being a self-aware bimbo is amazing. You become everything men want visually, while also being everything they hate. Self-aware, sexually empowered, politically conscious, etc. Reverse the fetishization of femininity. There's credibility to the idea, but the lines become blurred when people begin to act dumb ironically. At what point are you just reinforcing stereotypes? There's also contradictions in being anti-capitalist while adopting an inherently consumerist aesthetic. That's probably why bimbo feminism hasn't really had much staying power and has rubbed many women the wrong way. But anti-intellectualism takes a much more direct form when it comes to right-wing populist politics, rejecting the role of experts, technocrats, in shaping public policy in favour of quote-unquote traditional values. Its resurgence in the West is generally seen as having started in the mid-2010s, marked by events such as the first election of Donald Trump and the UK's Brexit referendum. In the latter example, a key refrain was that the public had had enough of experts, in response to warnings about the potential economic fallout of leaving the European Union. And I won't get into that. By 2017, a majority of Republicans felt that colleges and universities had a negative impact on the direction of their country, and this sentiment only seems to have grown since then, based partly on the perception that these institutions deliberately instill specific ideologies in their students, rather than critically evaluating information. There's a feeling among many that the experts supposedly in charge have failed us, that they've had their chance to improve society and aren't part of the solution to our current problems. To an extent, this is understandable, given the decline in living standards that many have experienced in the West, with human needs like housing being less affordable than ever. Of course, the truth is more complex than this. While governments do consult experts, politicians are subject to political pressures that take precedence. Passing legislation in a democracy requires votes from representatives, and those representatives have interests in their constituencies and a need to align with their voters for when election day comes. It's rarely experts actually pulling the levers of government. The second Trump administration has taken this even further than before, with many cabinet picks and senior officials not having the usual experience in their assigned areas. And his anti-intellectual approach hasn't exactly failed him electorally, with a notable growth in support between 2020 and 2024 among those 18 and 29 years old. This would seem to suggest a sizable increase in support among Gen Zs for Trump, especially among young men, and it's beginning to look like Gen Z is the first generation to be more conservative than their immediate predecessor. To be blunt, I don't think anti-intellectualism is a good thing. I think expertise is valuable, and I have a ton of respect for those who put in the thousands of hours to master their field. I also think it's sad that some people would deliberately act less competent than they are, even if it's done with the intention of countering their own exploitation or as a reaction to what other demographics are able to get away with. But also, I get it. The world is fucked, and I don't think any of us are immune to letting vibes supersede the rational part of our brain, especially when the world feels like it's beyond saving. But it isn't beyond saving, or at least I hope it isn't. More than ever, we have to make consuming information a conscious activity, critically evaluating everything we see and hear before we let ideas permeate our minds. And this is incredibly difficult because we've spent the best part of 2 decades as frogs being slowly boiled, becoming hooked on a form of information consumption blended with entertainment. We have to disentangle ourselves from the mess that is social media driven news cycles and algorithmically optimized headlines. And as difficult as that may be, things are a lot less hopeless when we learn to distinguish the signal from the noise. But what do you think? Do you find yourself overwhelmed by the sheer volume of information you encounter on social media, or do you feel you've become adept at deciphering the truth from the informational sewage in our feeds? Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below and drop a like and subscribe while you're down there, it really helps me out. I release a new video every couple of weeks. Also, thanks to one of my subscribers, Henning Claverness, for providing several of the ideas in this video, it's appreciated. If there's anything you'd be interested in hearing me cover, drop a comment down below or email me via the email address on my page. Until next time, see ya.